You're listening to Females in Fantasy, a podcast elevating the voices of women authors of science fiction and fantasy who write about kick-ass heroines. I am your host, Brianna De Silva, and this is episode 12. And today we are talking with Aliette de Bodard about a bunch of different topics, including gender socialization, stereotypes, and how they affect our unconscious decisions while writing, and also things like immigration and diaspora identity. Real quick, before we get into this interview, if you are the kind to skip the outro at the end of the episodes, don't do that today because I have something important to tell you after the interview. So you'll want to stick around for that. All right, here's my conversation with Aliette. Welcome, Aliette, to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. It's wonderful weather over here in Paris. It's like not too hot and there's a lot of sun. So I'm pretty good.
Oh man, I'm a little bit jealous. I mean, it's actually, it's pretty much the opposite right here in Virginia, but it's also kind of cool. We've had like a whole week of storms. We had like an almost tornado that happened on Monday, and then a really big lightning storm that happened on Tuesday.
Oh, whoa.
And like nonstop rain since then, which
is that a seasonal usual thing?
Virginia is kind of like, it just kind of does what it wants. So like there isn't really a normal, but the storms are pretty normal for like summers here, just kind of getting it a little bit early, I guess. And usually it doesn't last a whole week, but yeah, it's kind of peaceful. Just look outside and just like drizzling, like a little bit of a lullaby from nature. Oh. It made me very sleepy.
You can stay in and work and something.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I've been doing.
Well, that works.
Yeah. All right. So tell us about you, like how you first got into writing, what kind of things you like to write, and, you know, like your favorite color, stuff like that.
Okay. So my name's Aliette de Bodard. I'm a writer of fantasy and science fiction. I've been a writer for, something like 12 years now, I think, or something. Okay. I was your stereotypical kid with like, you know, the pile of books that was higher than them in the library when I was a kid. I would badger my parents to go to the library every Saturday because I could get more books, because I would have finished all the ones I borrowed the previous Saturday. And I spent about most of my school years thinking that writers were male and white and dead, because the French curriculum does give you a very skewed view of what is acceptable literature.
Oh my.
And then I discovered that actually there were living writers, which was really surprising. I mean, I had met some of them, so it shouldn't have been so much of a surprise, but because so much of the French curriculum is geared towards the 18th, 19th centuries, so it's a lot of like, dead people to find a point on it. And so when I was 16 or 17, my family moved to London and I was bored and I was like, I could try writing a book. I mean, I don't have to actually publish the book, but I could write the book. I wrote the book. We moved back to Paris from London. The computer crashed and the book is lost.
Oh no.
So I learned early on a very important lesson about having backups, which I did on those little, floppy disks. The other important lesson I learned, which do not let a floppy disk near a magnet. So I kind of feel like I paid my dues on the whole losing data thing very early on. So I wrote a couple of really bad novels that I still have, but that will probably never see the light of day. And then I started writing short stories because I had this really stupid, foolish idea that writing short stories was somehow going to be easier than writing novels. It's just a completely different thing rather than actually easier. What was easier was getting readers for them, though, because it's easier to get someone to say, will you read my 20-page story? Rather than, here is my 200,000-word novel. Do you want to read it? So I read short stories, then I got bored of short stories and I started writing novels, and then I've been sort of mixing the two for like the last 10 years or so, I guess. I'm the author of the Suya Universe series, which is basically this alternate history where you have galactic empires that are based on Chinese, Vietnamese, generally Confucian cultures rather than being based on some version of ancient Rome, because that's what I grew up with when I was a kid. I mean, all the stuff that I grew up with as a kid was scholars having adventures and taking care of their aged moms, which is kind of a staple of the genre. And I was like, well, I want that, but in space with spaceships. The other series I've got going is Dominion of the Fallen, which is, remember the 19th century dead French writers I had to study? One of the things that really struck me was this was also the height of the French colonial empires, and no one really ever mentions the French colonial subjects. So I kind of felt a little excluded from these stories. So I basically wrote an alternate 19th century Paris that's been devastated by a war, and which deals with colonial history and also deals with has a lot of queer protagonists, because I kind of felt that was also missing. I mean, there's a few things that are, I mean, I was rereading Count of Monte Cristo, and at one point two of the female characters elope together in a way that is pretty explicit. So I was like, yay, but I would like more like this. So I put that in my books too.
That's interesting, you know, because I remember I like listened to like an audiobook version of The Count of Monte Cristo, and I don't remember that. I wonder if like, I don't know, that's funny.
It never really comes out and says that they're sleeping together. There's like this character who it's Danglars' daughter, who is very, very friendly with her piano teacher, and the two of them like leave together for Brussels. It could simply be very good friends, or at the time, given the time period, it could also be like, you know, we're going to say they're lesbians without actually saying it. It's borderline. I mean, I wouldn't actually say it's like the best, you know, on the page rap ever, but I was like, oh my God, something, which is a bit sad, really,
definitely.
But.
Yeah, but that's awesome. Okay, I would love to talk. Well, I'm going to come back to some of those, but let's talk first about your most recent release, the Tea Master and the Detective. So give us a little rundown about that story.
Okay, well, the Tea Master and the Detective is basically gender-swapped Sherlock Holmes in space, with Holmes as a kind of like really eccentric, really abrasive scholar in a Vietnamese society, and Watson as this military spaceship who's been discharged and is now struggling to make a living. And the two of them meet and sparks fly, essentially. There's a dead body also, you know, there's also an investigation. It's my homage to A Study in Scarlet. So I crammed it full of like Holmes references, because like I really love Sherlock Holmes, and I've watched, I can't say I've watched all the adaptations because there have been so many of them, but I've watched a lot of them and enjoyed a lot of them. And I'm fascinated by, you know, this idea of like the abrasive genius. But one of the things that really irritated me about Sherlock, the BBC series, is in the Sherlock Holmes stories, Holmes is fundamentally good. He's not nice, that's different, but he's good. And he's trying to do the right thing. And he's also like very abrasive, but in a very specific, like he's abrasive with very powerful people. And he tends to come down rather easier on people who are struggling to make a living and working class people. And there's a couple of stories where it's very clear, for instance, I can't remember, there's the one with Charles Augustus Milverton, in which he's very sympathetic to the working class mistress who gets dumped by the blackmailer, and has vastly less sympathy for the aristocratic one who's comes across as very arrogant. And so I kind of wanted to take all of that and put it in a story. And so I wrote this, essentially. And it came out from Subterranean in March. Yeah, March. And so there's an ebook. And then since that's the North American version, and then outside of North America, I'm self-publishing it, essentially. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about those characters, because there's something kind of interesting about, I mean, Sherlock Holmes is such a classic, well-loved character, obviously, because we have so many different versions of him. But I think it's really cool that you have these characters like gender swapped, or is it just the basically the Sherlock character that's gender swapped, or does the spaceship have a gender? Spaceships have gender. So the Watson one is female, and then there's a non-binary one. She'd be an auntie if she was actually gendered, but like I said, the elderly grandparents spaceship who's like, I know everything that's happening and I don't approve of any of it, but have some food. So they're both gender swapped, really.
Okay. Yeah. So there's one thing that like I've kind of noticed is that the character of Sherlock, like as you mentioned, tends to be kind of abrasive, and some depends on the interpretation of the character, but sometimes is seen as kind of aloof, kind of blunt, and like also like really super intelligent. But it's often like it seems like this kind of a character a lot of people have a hard time imagining as female. And I'm not sure like how much of that like applies to the character that you wrote, but why do you think that is? Like, why do you think that there's this kind of like certain kinds of characters are less likely to be portrayed as female? They're usually guys. Yeah. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's very much easier to be abrasive if you're a straight man. I mean, speaking as a woman, my personal experience is like when you're abrasive, you don't really have to be very abrasive to come across as being hysterical rather than abrasive. And at least, again, all of this is like my personal experience, but we're also vastly more likely to be taught to be nice, to be polite. And so it's very culturally, I guess there's a lot of emphasis being put on women smiling, women being pleasant. So the stereotype of like a woman who is deliberately unpleasant. What was I going to say? Characters who are not particularly unpleasant, and I got a lot of flack because people thought that they were not being nice, essentially. And with this one, I was like, oh, let's forget all of it. She's going to be unpleasant because that's the way she rolls, and take that, everyone else. For me, I don't see the character as being particularly gendered male, Sherlock Holmes, but I'm also aware that, I had to teach myself over more than a couple of years of actually pushing back against the narrative of like, women can be unpleasant, women can be geniuses as well. I think Sherlock Holmes plays a lot with that idea of like the lone genius, which isn't really exactly what's in the stories either, but that's what he's become culturally speaking, as he casts this kind of long shadow of the eccentric genius. And both of these, the eccentricity and the genius, tend to be very, very much associated with men. Unfairly, there are lots of women geniuses. But it's very hard, I think, and I work in STEM, so I see it all the time. It's very hard to be a genius and unpleasant and actually, not get a lot of pushback for it. So I think that's where it comes from for me.
Okay, so you're saying it's basically like a lot of the ways that like men and women are like socialized and like how like we're brought up and encouraged to behave, that even if someone has that kind of a personality, they'd be less likely to exhibit that, and so that maybe leaks into our stories. Okay.
Yeah, I think you'd need kind of like some kind of like, if you keep being told as a kid that what you're doing is not okay, then you are likely going to internalize that kind of behavior. I mean, I see it with my kids. Gendering starts freaking early. I mean, mine was like 2 when he couldn't play with dolls, and I was like, this is my arrow face. He can play with dolls. He can wear pink if he wants to. Sparkles are cool. But I think that, it's really an uphill thing to fight against societal expectations. It's not impossible, but it's a bit the difference between being at the bottom of the mountain and being told that you have to reach the top and being already at the top of the mountain. Statistically speaking, you're going to have more people who started from the top of the mountain shouting from the top of the mountain than people who started from the bottom of the mountain shouting from the top of the mountain because they have to make it there. So mean, I blame society a lot.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I haven't really heard that explained in that way exactly. But yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Do you ever find that some kind of like internalized biases or those kinds of social expectations for how certain genders are supposed to behave, do you ever find that like sneak into your own writing, and if so, how do you combat that?
I mean, I'm like, not only does it sneak in my own writing, it's like doing it all the time, I mean, a lot of it is like, it's a continuous fight of like, okay, am I doing this wrong? Yes, I am doing this wrong, and I hadn't realized I was doing it wrong. So the specific example I can think of was when I wrote The House of Shattered Wings, which was my first 19th century Gothic fantasy novel, the ones that are set in Paris. I was convinced that my entire cast was like majority female. And then I sat down and I did the math, and they were barely breaking even in terms of gender. But because
I've had that happen too.
It was a bit of an eye opener, and I was like, okay, well, let's read it. And what I realized was like, I was doing okay on like main characters. I had 2 female main characters and 1 man. I was sort of doing okay in like the secondaries, and then whenever I would reach for a random like spare character, like bodyguard or whatever, they would be male. I was like, okay. And so since there were so many of them, it was that skewing the statistics. And I was like, I was writing this universe where there were no particular gendered expectations on people. So I was like, there is literally no reason for the bodyguard to be male. And then, even if there had been gendered expectations, yes. I mean, it is also not my job as the writer to give in to societal expectations. I kind of feel actually that my job is the reverse, is kind of challenging them and making sure that, all the screwy things that gets pushed on kids and on adults doesn't actually get a large tribune. But
yeah, I actually had a very similar thing happen with a fantasy manuscript that I'm working on, where I didn't even realize that like so many of the minor characters were all male, and it just like I just didn't even notice it until I like looked for it, and some people that are listening might not be fully aware of like kind of the phenomenon that we're referring to, but there's this thing where and people have done, there have been some studies to back this up, that if you have like a group of people, like for example a classroom, classroom example is a good one to demonstrate, but there was a study where there was a teacher that intentionally called on all the different students in the classroom equally, like for ask them questions, and when girls were getting like actually the same amount of attention as guys, that the boys, when they were polled, they would have this perception, and maybe it was all the kids, when they were polled, that the girls were speaking more than the boys. And then if the girls were speaking like something like a third of the time or something, then the perception was that it was equal. And so there's this weird socialization that has happened where we kind of expect to see women less than men, and we seem to think that there's more of them than there are. And yeah, it's a big problem.
I think it's like, I can't remember, like, because I always swap them around, but I think it's like at 17% people think that it's equal.
Oh man.
And at 30% people think that women are taking over. And I'm like, no.
Wow.
All of this is well below 50%, guys. And I think they're in the Gina Davis statistics. One of them is on the Gina Davis statistics that she did on movies and like on talking time of men versus women. And I can't remember what the source of the other one is. I mean, I really need to find a good source for these ones, but like I was really struck. I'm like, okay. And I'm not surprised, because again, we've been like, socialized to expect that women would talk less. And that it's normal, but it's like, okay, fine. And I think like any bias is the kind of thing that you have to fight all the time.
Yeah, for sure.
Reinforced all the time.
Yeah, because it keeps self-perpetuating itself, right? So like if someone has that perception, and then they write a story or whatever, or they when they're choosing people to speak on a like at a conference or whatever, like or choosing people to talk on a talk show, like whatever, there's some sort of a decision that's made to have people speak or have people represented. When you then still have that disparity, it continues, then the perception continues when we're just used to it, and it's subconscious. That's the problem, is that like we'll continue to think that unless we like actually look at it more consciously and like, wait a second, like let's add things up and see if it's actually the way we perceive it to be.
Yeah, the Excel spreadsheet I found was really useful. Okay, so here's who's around here. Like, okay, here are all the characters. Here's all the gender of the characters. Here, like the ethnicity of all the characters. Here's the like. I also did one for sexual orientation, like a little harder because like not all of them were actually on the page, and I kind of feel like that's cheating to say so and so is secretly gay. Yeah, right. So, but it's really like an eye opener of like, okay, well, I'm going to need to work on that.
Yeah. What are some tropes of female characters in science fiction and fantasy that annoy you?
The lone woman is probably the head of the pack. It's like the girl who's not like other girls. And
oh, yeah, that's so annoying.
And I mean, on some level, I get it because, I was that girl when I was a kid because, well, I was brought up to think so much less of women. So I kind of expected that, not being a girl meant that I would, I guess, have some of the male privileges or something. But in real life, I think this is extremely damaging because, like, it undervalues female friendships. It, like, makes the fact of, not being like other girls something to be valued. And it also prevents like showing support networks, which I think are very important things to show in novels and short stories. And a lot of the there's been, for instance, in fantasy novels, there's always like the girl who's not like other girls, and I'm like, it's a gendered, like you've established that this is a gendered society. Why are women not supporting each other? They didn't just like go away in the harem or wherever you put them and then sit knitting all day. That was literally not what they were doing. And that is kind of very, cardboardy feeling to like, even in societies that have a very clear oppressive strand against women, there's this feeling that they don't matter. And this is very different, saying they're oppressed is not, they don't matter, is not, they don't have a story. And that always pisses me off.
Yeah, like just because the society is seeing them as unimportant doesn't mean that they're actually existing in unimportant ways. And and so that's really problematic.
Exactly.
Yeah, if an author is writing in a way where it's like it can seem when they do that it's not the value of their world anymore, but it's actually the value of the author.
Well, if it keeps repeating across several books, I'm getting to the point where I'm like, yeah. Author bias, I think it's called.
I won't say the name of one, but there was a big book that I quit reading at some point for that reason, because I was just like, I feel like this is the author, the way he sees women. But
I regularly go off on epic rants of like, this is not how women work in historical settings. I swear this is yes, they couldn't rule, but no. And my husband would be like, why don't you give up on the book? And I'm like, I'm stubborn. I want to get to the end. And he's like, so many books, so little time.
Yeah, I'm more like your husband there. I just quit stuff if I don't like it. I'm like, no,
my husband just quits. Yeah, I'm like, okay, fine. I've quit a couple, but generally I tend to get to the end.
Yeah. So I decided to bring you on when I read your book, Shattered Among Strange Worlds. It was like a short little. It has like two short stories. And absolutely lovely. I really enjoyed it. And I think I'm going to test here if I was like reading into the kind of the meaning of the stories correctly or not. But it seemed like it was kind of like two different allegories for like diaspora identity and immigration. Was I right in figuring that out?
No, definitely. Definitely.
Yeah.
Scattered Along the River of Heaven. Actually, I was. It was one of the stories that I wrote after a long hiatus where I was trying to grapple with, this feeling of diaspora identity and what it meant, and, what things would then be passed on to the next generation, if any. And also, to some extent, especially with Exodus Tides, what it meant to be mixed race, and what it also means to have a homeland that has sort of I mean, very particular diaspora because the Vietnamese diaspora has had to grapple with Vietnam not being very accessible for a lot of time due to several things happening. So to me, growing up, there was certainly this kind of mythical homeland thing happening, which I don't think is happening quite as much if you can come back to, your family's homeland regularly, or have, regular contact with it. So to some extent, it's also very specific to my experience, which is what I get to write about. I was telling a friend, those are, if we don't tell our stories, then no one's going to do it for us. And with Scattered Along the River of Heaven in particular, I was trying to write about revolutions and what they mean 1 or 2 generations down the line, and how, the past is sometimes forgotten, and is this a good or a bad thing? And one of the things I didn't want to do with the story was answer the question, because I don't think there's necessarily a right answer for everyone. And it felt a little bit facile, especially in the short story, saying, look, this is the right answer. I'm the author and I said so. So I wanted to leave it ambiguous, and to some extent to leave the reader to make up their own mind about what they thought should go on.
Yeah. Yeah. I enjoyed both, and I thought the second one, I forget the title of it, but it was like with more people trying to merge with French society. That was really interesting. For one, I thought like the description of those more people was very like kind of detailed. I could kind of see them, like as as people in my mind. But yeah, could you tell us a little bit more about that, and like why you chose to explore that theme like in that particular way?
I wanted to do, originally, I wanted to do a sea bride kind of story. So a Selkie. Well, there's Selkies, but there's all sorts of different fairy tales about the fisherman who brings a bride from the sea who's like a little strange and a little odd in various different ways, and then gives him a child, and depending on the story, generally tends to go away. And one of the things that I wanted to do was, like, it's always a single bride. She's always very isolated. And one of the things that I wanted to do was, okay, but, they must have a family. And I get that, the fairy tales are not necessarily about that. And it's also possible to be isolated. But I wanted to write a slightly different narrative. So I actually gave the mer people, like, a more tangible presence. And the other thing I was grappling with was a certain feeling of annoyance, like the perception of immigration and the idea that you absolutely need to quote unquote fit in when you're an immigrant, which generally means, like, throwing everything that is not of value to the society that takes you in. And I was like, okay, but why are we having this conversation that way? That doesn't strike me as being the right framing for it. And it's like very heartless and very cruel, especially when we're talking about refugees, to tell them that they just have to, like, let go of everything. And to some extent, I come from a background where because when my family came, there was no return. There was no possibility of ever turning the other way. We were very strongly encouraged to not make waves and to assimilate. And to, my mom would not speak Vietnamese to us at home because effectively it was a dead language. The idea that one day we might go back to Vietnam when I was a kid was not on. And 40 years on, it actually seems a little, I don't know, intense, because I have actually been to Vietnam and it's a very nice place, but I also understand where this is coming from. When my mum left, there were bombs. So, I'm very much a child of that kind of migration, and I wanted to write a story where, so there was a homeland and there were fairy tales, and you kind of had both of these merging. And then I thought that it would be more interesting if the child was the one who wanted to leave rather than the mother.
It was interesting.
And that she made those choices. And so one of the things I was trying to do was kind of cast something that had very definite, like, real world sources, like, the seas got polluted and mermen had to find refuge with humans. And I kind of wanted to cast that in a very fairy tale way. So, once upon a time, there was a guy who found a wife and so on and so forth. And as the narrator grows up, she realizes that the fairy tales are not really true. But, in some ways, they're also true for her family. So I kind of wanted to untangle that. And, the sword, for instance, to me was like a really hard thing to wrangle with, because I wanted it to be realistic, but I also wanted it to be this kind of like, there's a long history of magical swords in various cultures, and I wanted to have that as something that would mean something to, basically a teenager who's like completely unsure of how to dance and what foot to set right, and who is has her head full of stories and is trying to make sense of the world through these stories.
Awesome. Well, we are about out of time. Actually, we went a little bit over time, but it's all good. How can people find you and keep up with your stuff?
I have a website at aliette-de-bodard.com, which has a newsletter, which is probably updated more often than the aliette-de-bodard.com/newsletter. And I am genuinely not in a position to spam people with things because I don't have time. So there's an occasional email about my new releases and what I get up to, and like exclusive information and so on. Otherwise, I'm very often on Twitter as AlietteDB, complaining about the difficulties of translating from Vietnamese to English and English to French and so on and so forth. And that's most of I'm on AlietteDB on Instagram as well, which is mostly food pictures.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on today, and you have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, and likewise.
That was my conversation with Aliette. And before you skip to the end, wait 1 second, please. I just wanted to let you all know that this episode is the end of season 1. I actually wasn't planning for there to be seasons when I started this podcast, but I got to the point where I needed a bit of a break. Needed a refresher so I could kind of reorient myself as I'm looking forward and figuring out what I want to do with this podcast in the future. So it'll just be a 1-month break. Season 2 will start back up on September 9th. But I just wanted to let you all know about that so that you're not surprised when you don't get a podcast in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, though, during this break, I would love to get your feedback. That will help me a lot while I am working on season 2. I have a little survey that you can fill out, and that is at bit.ly/FIF. That's for females in fantasy, and then survey. And that survey will only take about 2 to 3 minutes at the most, but it'll be really helpful, and really appreciate it if you took a second to fill that out. Again, that is bit.ly/FIFSURVEY, and I will include that in the show notes as well. Quick reminder that the merchandise shop is up at shop.femalesinfantasy.com. Bunch of different t-shirts and mugs that are available there. And I've got some more designs on the way as well, so keep an eye out for that. You can follow the podcast on Twitter and like it on Facebook. And if you like what you hear, please consider becoming a co-creator at patreon.com/femalesinfantasy. Or equally amazing would be to rate and review the podcast on iTunes. Since the last time that I asked for you all to rate and review, I think there was a podcast episode where I kind of made a big deal about it. I now have 3 amazingly nice reviews on iTunes, including this one from SJ Deal, who wrote, "I especially enjoy this as a writer of fantasy who primarily writes female characters. That said, even if you're not a writer, there are still a lot of really interesting perspectives and topics to learn about. Good audio quality, not too long or too short. The host is fantastic at asking questions," thank you, "adding commentary to thoughts brought up in the conversations, and sharing her own thoughts, etc. It has a lot of wonderful guests. I have really been enjoying this podcast." Thank you so much, SJ. I've been thinking maybe when we get to 10 reviews, or maybe 20 or something, we should do something special. Maybe a giveaway? I don't know. If you have any ideas, you can let me know in the survey. I would love to hear about that. Thank you to all of my patrons, and to Mireille Gash, and to the folks at Music Radio Creative for the editing, and to you, dear listener. This has been Females in Fantasy. I am Brianna Da Silva, and I will catch you all in a month. Thanks for listening.